Hey guys. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Not the shining legend. Not the dragons, not the gleaming hero riding into the sunset with a grateful kingdom at his back. No. Tonight we're going underneath all of that. Beneath the myth, beneath the pageantry, beneath the polished surface of everything you think you know about medieval knights. Tonight we're talking about the cold. The weight. The sleepless nights on hard ground with 50 pounds of metal wrapped around your body and the dark pressing in from every direction. Tonight we're talking about what it actually felt like. Not in the songs. Not in the tapestries. In the mud and the silence and the long, grinding hours between battles when a man had to figure out how to rest inside a shell of iron because the alternative was dying unprepared. So before we begin, if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And drop your city and time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. Now, dim the lights. Let the weight of the day begin to lift. Settle in. And let's begin with a night you'll never forget. You don't choose to sleep in your armor. Not the first time. The first time, it happens because you have no choice. You're 17 years old, 3 days into your first real campaign, and the rain hasn't stopped since you left the last village behind. The tent you were promised never arrived. The fire you built drowned before it caught. And somewhere out in the dark, beyond the tree line where the shadows move in ways that might be wind or might be men, someone could be watching your camp. Your knight gives the order without looking at you. Keep it on tonight. That's all. No explanation. No reassurance. Just 4 words and the sound of him settling into the mud with his back against a tree, visor down, gauntlets still buckled. So you do the same. You lie on your back in the wet grass, the weight of your armor pressing you into the earth like a hand. The gorget presses against your throat every time you swallow. Your breath fogs the inside of your helmet, warm and damp and stale, like air that's already been used by someone else. You don't sleep. Not really. You drift in and out of something that isn't quite consciousness. A gray, restless place between exhaustion and alertness where every sound snaps you back to the surface. A branch cracking. A horse shifting. The low murmur of men on watch. By dawn, your back aches in places you didn't know had names. Your neck has locked into a single position. When you finally remove the helmet, the cold morning air hits your face like a mercy. Your knight is already standing, already checking the perimeter. He doesn't ask how you slept. He already knows. This is not in the songs. The bards who sit by warm fires composing verses about knights and glory never mention this part. The part where a 17-year-old boy lies rigid on wet ground inside 50 pounds of metal, staring at a sky he can barely see, listening to the dark and wondering if he made a terrible mistake. But here's what the songs also don't mention. By the third night, it gets easier. Not comfortable. Never comfortable. But easier. Your body begins to negotiate with the armor the way it negotiates with any hard truth. It stops fighting and starts adapting. By the 5th night, you barely notice the gorget anymore. By the 10th, you sleep. Not deeply. Not peacefully. But you sleep. In fragments, in slivers, in the narrow spaces between sounds that might mean something and sounds that don't. You learn to let your body rest while some smaller, quieter part of your mind stays on watch. A soldier's sleep. Half in the world, half out of it. Your knight calls it sleeping with one eye open. You'll spend the next 20 years learning to do it properly. The historical truth is straightforward. Medieval campaigns offered almost no reliable shelter. An army on the march moved through whatever terrain lay between it and its objective, and the terrain rarely included comfortable lodgings for every man in the column. Castles were too few and too far apart. Villages were commandeered when available, but a village that could house a lord and his household knights had no room for the hundreds of men-at-arms who marched behind them. So you slept outside. On grass when you were lucky. On mud when you weren't. In rain more often than not, because campaigns rarely paused for weather. And you kept your armor on because the alternative was being caught without it. The fringe detail that most history books skip over entirely is this. Some knights became so conditioned to sleeping in armor that they reportedly struggled to sleep without it. Veterans of long campaigns would return home to soft beds and warm chambers and lie awake for hours, their bodies confused by the absence of weight. The armor had become their normal. Its pressure, its restriction, its constant low-level discomfort had been absorbed so completely that comfort itself felt wrong. There are accounts, second-hand and unverified but persistent, of old knights asking their squires to lay pieces of armor across their chests as they slept. Not for protection. Just for the weight. Just for the familiar press of metal that meant the world was as it should be. The debate among historians is whether sleeping in armor was standard practice or emergency measure. Some argue it was reserved for genuine danger. Others point to the sheer frequency with which medieval chronicles mention armed men sleeping to suggest it was far more common than we assume. You don't have an opinion on the historical debate. You just know what your knight told you on that first cold night. Keep it on. And you did. And you survived. And that, more than anything, is the education that no page or squire ever received in a classroom. You pull your cloak tighter over the metal. It doesn't help much. But it helps a little. And a little, on a night like this, is everything. 50 pounds sounds like a number until you've worn it for 16 hours straight. Then it stops being a number and becomes something else. A presence. A companion you didn't choose and can't dismiss. Something that lives on your body and has opinions about every movement you make. Your armor, by the time you're a full knight, is not a single thing. It is a collection of things, each with its own weight, its own personality, its own specific way of making your life difficult. It starts with the gambeson. A quilted linen garment stuffed with wool or rags, worn closest to the skin. It is your first layer, and your last defense against the metal grinding directly into your flesh. It is also, after a week in the field, the worst-smelling object you have ever owned. It absorbs everything. Sweat, rain, blood when the fighting gets close. You wash it when you can, which is not as often as you'd like, and not as effectively as you need. Over the gambeson goes the chain mail. Thousands of interlocking iron rings, flexible enough to move with you, heavy enough to make you aware of gravity in a new and personal way. It drapes across your shoulders like a decision you can't take back. The rings catch your hair if you're not careful. They leave small circular impressions in your skin after long wear, a pattern like fish scales pressed into flesh. Over the mail, the plate. Breastplate and backplate first, buckled together at the sides. Then the pauldrons, curved shells cupping your shoulders. Vambraces for your forearms. Gauntlets for your hands, articulated metal gloves that protect your fingers but make delicate tasks, eating, writing, adjusting a strap, into small engineering challenges. Greaves for your shins. Sabatons encasing your feet, overlapping metal scales that let you walk and flex but remind you with every step that your feet are no longer entirely your own. And finally the helmet. Placed last, removed first, and for the hours it sits on your head, the single most claustrophobic object ever designed by human hands. Together, they weigh between 45 and 70 pounds depending on the quality and completeness of the suit. A full harness of plate from a good Italian or German smith sits toward the heavier end. A patched and partial suit of mixed mail and plate, which is what most knights actually wore for most of the medieval period, sits lighter. But even 40 pounds, worn for an entire day of marching and riding and fighting, is enough to change you permanently. Your squire helps you arm each morning. It takes close to an hour done properly. He works in sequence, bottom to top, checking each buckle and strap as he goes. If he misses something, you'll know. Not immediately, sometimes not for hours. But the dented buckle will find the gap in your padding. The loose strap will shift under pressure. The slightly misaligned gorget will chafe a raw line into your neck by midday. You correct him without anger when he's new, with slightly more emphasis when he isn't. The historical record on armor weight is interesting in what it reveals about the people who wore it. Skeletal remains of medieval knights show specific patterns of bone development, muscle attachment sites enlarged and reinforced in ways that differ from comparable non-knightly remains. The body adapts. It builds itself around the load it carries. A man who has worn armor since his early teens develops a physical architecture shaped by that weight. Some remains show evidence of spinal compression consistent with years of heavy load. Hip joints worn in ways that suggest decades of mounted combat. Shoulder bones shaped by the specific stress of sword work in full harness. The body keeps records that no chronicle ever bothered to write down. The fringe detail is this. Medieval physicians, the better ones anyway, were aware of what armor did to the body over time. There are records of treatments specifically designed for what we would now call repetitive strain injuries. Herbal poultices applied to swollen joints. Warm water baths with specific mineral additives. And one practice, found in several independent sources, that describes suspending a knight horizontally in water to decompress the spine after long campaigns. A crude traction therapy. Surprisingly logical. Probably quite pleasant after months in the field. The debate is whether the physical cost of knighthood was considered by the men who chose it. Some historians argue that medieval knights had no framework for understanding cumulative injury. Each wound healed, or didn't. Each ache was noted and ignored. The long-term consequences were invisible until they weren't. Others argue that knights knew exactly what they were trading. That the physical cost was understood, accepted, and filed alongside every other cost of the profession. You don't philosophize about it much. You're too busy carrying it. What you know is this. By midday the armor feels lighter than it did at dawn. Not because it has changed, but because you have settled into it. Your posture adjusts, your stride shortens slightly to account for the greaves, your arms swing less freely and you stop noticing that they do. By evening you are the armor as much as you are wearing it. And when your squire finally unbuckles the last strap and lifts the breastplate away at the end of the day, the sensation is so sudden and so complete that you stand still for a moment, blinking, like a man who has just stepped out of a river. Lighter. Stranger. Temporarily uncertain which version of yourself is the real one. The answer, after enough years, is both. The battlefield doesn't announce itself. That's the thing the songs never capture and the training never fully prepares you for. The charge, yes. The tournament, yes. The single combat, the siege, the ordered advance across a known field against a visible enemy. These things have rules, rhythms, patterns you can learn and practice and prepare for. But the knight has no rules. You learn this early. Not from a lesson. From a sound. You're in camp 3 miles from a contested castle, third week of a siege that everyone has stopped pretending will end quickly. The night is clear for once, cold and still, and the watch has been posted and the fires banked and 200 men have settled into the various uncomfortable positions that pass for sleep on campaign. And then there is a sound. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a sound that is slightly wrong in a world of sounds that should be familiar. A footstep where there should be no footstep. A shadow that moves against the direction of the wind. You are upright before you have consciously decided to be. Your hand is on your sword before your eyes have fully opened. The armor that you almost removed an hour ago is still on your body because some instinct built from nights like this one, told you to wait. The man who comes through the outer edge of the camp is not a soldier. He is a scout, or an assassin, or a desperate opportunist, or something in between. It doesn't entirely matter. What matters is that he expected to find sleeping men. He found you standing instead. The encounter is brief and unpleasant and ends with the man retreating into the dark at considerable speed. You don't pursue. The camp is the priority. The camp is always the priority. In the morning your knight nods at you once. The nod of a man who expected nothing less, and is mildly pleased to have been right. You don't mention that you nearly took the armor off. The historical reality of medieval camp security is far grimmer than the popular imagination allows. Modern depictions tend to show medieval armies as organized, disciplined forces with clear perimeters and reliable watch systems. The reality was considerably messier. Watch rotations were inconsistent. Bribery of sentries was common. The sheer size of some medieval armies made complete perimeter security essentially impossible. Night raids were a standard tactical tool. The Battle of Agincourt, one of the most famous engagements of the medieval period, was preceded by a tense night during which the English fully expected a French night attack. Henry V kept his entire force in near silence for hours, helmets on, weapons ready. The attack never came. But the preparation was absolute. The Welsh and Scottish raiders who plagued English borders for centuries were famous for dawn attacks, arriving in the grey light before full visibility when sleeping men were at their groggiest and most vulnerable. The border lords who survived long careers in those regions developed the same habit you have. Armor on. Sword close. Sleep light. Treachery is the darker truth. Not all nighttime threats came from outside the camp. Medieval armies were coalitions, alliances of men who might be loyal to overlapping or conflicting lords. A knight who had made enemies, which was almost every knight who had lived long enough, slept knowing that the threat might wear a familiar face. The fringe detail that history tends to gloss over is the documented frequency of camp murders. Not battlefield deaths but cold, quiet killings in the night, a knife between plates of poorly secured armor, a blow to an unguarded head. These deaths were rarely investigated thoroughly. A man found dead in a campaign camp had usually, officially, died in the fighting. The debate among military historians is significant. Was the medieval camp a place of relative safety or a place of constant low-level danger? Some argue that the codes of military conduct, the rules of war recognized and observed by most Christian European forces, created genuine safety within the camp. Others point to the casualty records, the private letters, the quiet mentions and chronicles of men found dead in ways that didn't entirely fit the official narrative. You lean toward the second view. Experience tends to produce realists. What you know is this. The nights you slept without your armor were the nights nothing happened. You don't know if that's coincidence or causation. You've decided it doesn't matter. The armor stays on. You settle back against the tree that has been your bed for 3 nights now. The bark presses into the back plate with a dull familiarity. Your sword is across your lap, not drawn, but accessible in the way that a good tool is always accessible to a man who knows his trade. Above you the stars are very clear and very cold and very indifferent to your situation. You close your eyes. You don't exactly sleep, but you rest. And sometimes, on a campaign, that has to be enough. You learn to sleep like a cat. Light. Brief. Always with some part of you still listening. This is not something anyone teaches you directly. There is no lesson in the page's training hall, no chapter in the manuals of chivalry, no wise knight who sits you down and explains the mechanics of fractured rest. You learn it the way you learn most things that matter. By doing it badly until you do it less badly. By surviving the mistakes. The first few weeks on campaign you sleep too deeply or not at all. There is no middle ground. Exhaustion drags you under completely and you wake disoriented, heart pounding, reaching for a weapon before you remember where you are. Or you lie rigid and wakeful for hours, every sound an alarm, every shadow a threat, your body running at full alert until dawn finds you more exhausted than the night before. Neither is sustainable. The body, eventually, figures this out. What develops, over weeks and months and years, is something that doesn't have a clean name. Not sleep exactly. Not wakefulness. A threshold state, like standing in a doorway with one foot in each room. Your body rests. Your breathing slows, your muscles release their tension by degrees, your heart finds a quieter rhythm. But some smaller, quieter part of your mind stays at the door. Listening. Cataloging. Sorting the sounds of the night into categories. Safe. 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 Uncertain. Safe. Safe. The uncertain ones don't wake you fully. They bring you up to the threshold, to that gray place where your hand moves toward your sword without conscious instruction, and your eyes open slightly, enough to scan, enough to assess. If the sound resolves into something explainable, you sink back. If it doesn't, you're on your feet. This process happens dozens of times a night. You are not aware of most of them. It is, in the language of a later age, exactly what it sounds like. Interrupted sleep. Fragmented rest. The thing that sleep physicians would eventually identify as deeply harmful to human health. And yet here is the strange contradiction at the heart of it. You are not unhealthy. You are remarkably functional. You ride and fight and think and lead and make complex decisions under pressure in ways that suggest your brain is receiving something it needs, even if the delivery method would horrify a modern doctor. The historical grounding for this is fascinating and largely forgotten. Before the Industrial Revolution, before artificial light reorganized human biology around the demands of the factory and the office, most people did not sleep in a single unbroken 8-hour block. They slept in 2 segments, separated by a period of wakefulness that lasted an hour or 2 in the middle of the night. The first sleep, falling shortly after dark. A period of wakefulness, used for prayer, for quiet reflection, for conversation with a bedfellow, for the small domestic tasks that candlelight permitted. Then the second sleep, carrying through until dawn. This pattern shows up consistently in medieval writing. People refer to their first sleep and their second sleep as naturally as they refer to breakfast and supper. The wakefulness between them is not insomnia. It is expected. It is normal. It is, in some sources, described as a particularly clear-headed and reflective time, the mind neither fully asleep nor fully occupied with the demands of the waking world. For a knight on campaign, this natural human rhythm is amplified and distorted by circumstance into something more extreme but not entirely different in kind. You sleep. You wake. You sleep again. The watches change. The night moves. The threat level fluctuates. And through all of it you piece together enough rest to function, to fight, to survive. The fringe detail is this. Several medieval monastic sources, writing about the sleep habits of soldiers and knights, note with some disapproval that men who had been long on campaign developed an almost animal quality to their rest. They could fall asleep in any position, in any conditions, for any duration, and wake fully alert without transition. No grogginess. No disorientation. Eyes open, hand on sword ready. The monks found this unsettling. You find it practical. There is a debate worth considering here. Some historians of sleep argue that the medieval pattern of segmented rest was not inferior to modern consolidated sleep, but simply different. That the human brain adapted over millennia to function in this broken rhythm, and that the modern insistence on 8 uninterrupted hours is itself a historical anomaly, a recent invention that our biology has not fully accepted. Others disagree. They point to the accumulated sleep debt of campaign soldiers, the cognitive degradation visible in poor tactical decisions made during prolonged campaigns, the letters home that become shorter and stranger as exhaustion deepens. Both are probably right. The body adapts. The body also suffers. These two things are not mutually exclusive. What you know is the arithmetic of it. 2 hours here. 3 there. An hour before the watch changes. Half an hour in the saddle during the long march when the road is straight, and your horse knows its own way and you can let your chin drop to your chest and drift. You piece it together. It holds. You rise each morning not exactly rested but functional. Capable. Ready for whatever the day intends to do to you. Which is, on a medieval campaign, the only standard worth measuring yourself against. There is an order to taking it off. Not a casual order, not a preference, but a sequence developed over generations by men who learn the hard way what happens when you skip a step. Miss the order and you'll spend 20 minutes untangling yourself from your own gorget. Rush the gauntlets and you'll catch a finger in the articulation and spend the next week explaining to your squire why you need him to cut your meat. It goes in reverse. Last on, first off. Helmet first, then gauntlets. Pauldrons, vambraces, the breastplate lifted away by your squire while you stand still and let the weight go. Then the greaves, the sabatons, the chain mail hauled over your head in a single practice motion that still manages to catch your ear at least once a week. And finally, the gambeson. You peel it away from your body with the careful attention of a man removing a second skin that has been attempting to become a first one. It is heavy with the day. Damp in every seam. The smell is something you have become so accustomed to that you no longer notice it except when you catch the expression on a servant's face when they collect it for washing. Without it, you are just a man. This is the moment that surprises people who have never worn armor. Not the weight, not the heat, not the restriction. The moment of removal. The sudden and absolute return to your own body, unmediated, unarmored, shockingly ordinary. You stand in your linen shirt and woolen hose and you feel the air moving against your skin and you are aware of your own softness in a way that the armor never allows. Beneath the steel you forget sometimes that you are flesh. The metal is so constant, so defining, that it becomes the reality and the body inside it becomes the abstraction. Then the armor comes off and the abstraction becomes real again. Your squire sets each piece on its stand with the careful reverence of a man who has been trained to treat armor as the living thing it practically is. He checks each piece as he sets it down, running his hands along edges, testing buckles, looking for damage that the heat of the fight might have hidden from immediate view. A crack in the breastplate. A rivet pulling loose. A strap worn through to the last thread. He tells you what he finds. You listen. You note it. In the morning it will be addressed. For tonight you are done. The historical record on armor removal is interesting in what it reveals about the social world of medieval knighthood. The squire's role in arming and disarming his knight was not merely practical. It was a declaration of relationship, of hierarchy, of mutual dependency. A knight who could not fully arm or disarm himself alone was, by design, dependent on his squire. This dependency was not accidental. It was engineered. The bond created by the daily intimacy of arming and disarming, the squire's hands on the most vulnerable moments of the knight's day, the knowledge exchanged in those quiet rituals, this was considered a fundamental part of what made the knight-squire relationship meaningful. The squire learned his knight's body as well as his own. He knew which shoulder carried old damage, which knee locked in cold weather, which piece of armor needed a particular touch to seat correctly. This knowledge was power. Benignly used, almost always. But power nonetheless. The fringe detail is one of the stranger footnotes in the history of medieval psychology. There are accounts, from multiple independent sources across different centuries and regions, of knights who returned from long campaigns and found themselves unable to sleep in a soft bed without armor. Not all of them, and not always. But consistently enough that the phenomenon appears in enough places to be more than coincidence. Some accounts describe it as insomnia. Lying awake in unaccustomed comfort, the body alert and waiting for threats that weren't there. Others describe something more physical, a sensation of wrongness, of exposure, of the body having reorganized itself around a weight that was no longer present. One account, from a French chronicle of the late 14th century, describes a veteran knight who wore his breastplate to bed for a month after returning from campaign. His wife, according to the chronicler, was not amused. The knight, according to the same source, slept better than he had in years. The debate is whether this represents genuine physical adaptation or psychological dependency. Whether the armor had become a comfort object, a security blanket made of steel, or whether the body had literally restructured its rest patterns around the physical reality of the weight, and found itself lost without it. You lie back on your actual bed, in your actual chamber, on a rare night when the campaign has paused long enough for something resembling civilization. The mattress is stuffed with wool. There are linen sheets. A fire in the hearth. It should be the finest sleep you've had in months. You lie awake for an hour, listening to the silence, and wonder if you left your sword close enough. You get up and move it closer. Then you sleep. Your shoulder tells you when rain is coming. Not a guess. Not a sense. A certainty, arriving 12 hours before the clouds, a deep ache that begins at the point where the pauldron has rested for 20 years and radiates down into the joint in a way that is unpleasant but oddly reliable. More reliable, if you're being honest, than most of the men who have served under you. You've made tactical decisions based on it. Adjusted marching schedules. Ordered shelters erected in clear skies because the shoulder said so. The men think you have some gift for reading weather. You don't correct them. The truth is less mystical and considerably more painful. This is what 20 years in armor does to a body. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Quietly, incrementally, in the spaces between one campaign and the next, in the cold mornings when getting up takes slightly longer than it did the year before, in the evenings when you notice your squire watching you from the corner of his eye with an expression he's trying to keep neutral. The hip that clicks on cold mornings. The right knee that locks if you've been sitting for too long and requires a specific motion to release, a motion you've practiced so often it's become unconscious. The lower back that speaks to you at the end of a long ride in a language that consists entirely of complaints. Your hands are the most honest record. Knuckles enlarged from 2 decades of sword work, the skin across them permanently roughened by gauntlet leather. The 4th finger on your left hand bent slightly from where it was broken in a tournament in your early 20s and healed crooked because you were back on a horse within the week. The scar tissue across your right palm, thin and pale now, from a blade that found the gap between gauntlet and vambrace on a day you still think about occasionally. Your body is an archive. Illegible to most, but detailed. The historical grounding for this is written in bone. Modern forensic archaeologists studying medieval skeletal remains have developed considerable expertise in reading a life's history from its physical evidence. Knights are particularly legible. The specific patterns of bone development, joint wear, and muscle attachment site enlargement that characterize a man who has worn armor and wielded weapons from adolescence are distinct and consistent across different centuries and regions. Osteoarthritis concentrated in the shoulders and hips. Vertebral compression in the lower spine. Specific wear patterns in the knee and ankle joints consistent with mounted combat. Dental evidence of repeated blows to the head absorbed through the helmet. Healed fractures in the hands and forearms, sometimes multiple fractures in the same bone, suggesting injuries that were never allowed full healing time before being stressed again. The bodies tell stories that the chronicles omit entirely. What is remarkable, and the historians note this with something between admiration and discomfort, is how functional these men remain despite the accumulated damage. The same remains that show significant joint degeneration also show the muscle development of men who were still riding and fighting into their 40s and 50s. The body adapts. It works around damage. It compensates, redistributes, finds new ways to accomplish what the original architecture can no longer manage cleanly. The fringe detail is a specific treatment found in several medieval medical texts that deserves more attention than it receives. The suspension therapy. A knight with severe spinal compression, a common complaint of veteran-mounted warriors, would be placed in a purpose-built apparatus that suspended his body horizontally in warm water, allowing the vertebrae to decompress under gravity rather than against it. This is, stripped of its medieval context and translated into modern terminology, spinal traction hydrotherapy. It is still used today. It works. The medieval physicians who developed it didn't have the vocabulary to explain why it worked, but they could observe that it did, and they recorded it carefully and passed the knowledge forward. Some knowledge survives its own explanations. The debate among medical historians concerns the overall health outcomes of medieval knights relative to comparable men of their class who didn't fight. The early death in battle is obvious and well documented. But among those who survived to old age, the comparison is less clear. Some studies of medieval skeletal populations suggest that the physical demands of knighthood, for all the damage they caused, also produced cardiovascular fitness and bone density that may have offered some protection against other causes of death. The knight who survives his wars, in other words, may have been in some ways healthier than the lord who stayed home. You find this mildly amusing. Cold comfort in the most literal sense. On winter mornings you move through a specific sequence before attempting the stairs. A rotation of the left shoulder to loosen the joint. A careful straightening of the spine, vertebra by vertebra, each one announcing itself with a sound that your squire has learned to pretend not to hear. The right knee extended and flexed twice before trusting it with weight. Then you descend the stairs. Slowly, not from infirmity, but from habit. From the years of descending stairs in full armor when caution was simply the correct approach. You carry the armor long after you've taken it off. In your hips, your spine, the slight leftward lean that developed in your 30s and has become simply the way you stand. The body keeps its own records and unlike the chronicles it edits nothing. Still, it carried you this far. You reached the bottom of the stairs without incident. That, on this particular morning, is enough. When the visor comes down, something changes. Not just in what you can see, not just in what you can hear, though both narrow considerably, the world reducing to a horizontal slit of light and a muffled approximation of sound. Something else changes. Something harder to name. You become smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because the helmet closes you in, reduces your world to breath and heartbeat, and the small enclosed space of your own skull. The noise of the battlefield, the shouting and the screaming and the terrible percussion of metal on metal, all of it reaches you through layers of steel as a kind of abstraction, a thing happening somewhere else, to someone else. Larger because the visor creates something between you and the world that looks, from the outside, like certainty. Like inevitability. Like a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply moving through the motions of confirming it. You don't feel certain. But the visor doesn't broadcast that. This is perhaps the most underappreciated technology of medieval warfare. Not the blade, not the lance, not the warhorse with its trained aggression and controlled momentum. The visor. The simple articulated plate that separated a man's face from the world and in doing so separated a part of his mind from its own fear. You have a ritual for the helmet. It developed over years, without conscious design, accumulating piece by piece the way all genuine rituals do. You put the helmet on last, always. You check the visor latch twice. Left thumb, then right. You speak a specific phrase, quietly, under your breath. Not a prayer exactly, though it contains the structure of one. More of a statement. A declaration of intent directed at no one in particular. Then you let it settle. There are 30 seconds, maybe 45, between the moment the helmet seats on your head and the moment you feel ready. You use them. Breathing deliberately. Letting the muffled world become familiar. Letting the narrow slit of vision become sufficient. Letting the weight on your skull become the anchor it needs to be. When you're ready, you nod to your squire. He steps back. You move forward. The historical record contains multiple accounts of specific pre-battle rituals tied to the arming process, and the helmet features prominently in many of them. Knights who prayed at each stage of arming. Who placed specific objects inside the helmet before wearing it, a lock of hair, a piece of cloth, a folded prayer. Who spoke words to their swords, to their horses, to the god they hoped was paying attention. These were not superstitions in the dismissive sense. They were technology. Psychological technology developed by men who understood, at some functional level, that their mental state in the first minutes of engagement would determine much of what followed. Who knew that the managed transition from man to warrior required ritual the same way it required armor. The fringe detail is a specific account from a 15th century German knight's memoir, one of the rare first-hand documents of the period, in which the knight describes what he calls the closing of the world. The moment the visor came down, he writes, was the moment he stopped being a man who might die and became something that did not have that option. He was not describing invincibility. He was describing a deliberate cognitive shift. The closing off of the part of the mind that calculated risk and the opening of the part that simply acted. Modern combat psychology has a name for this state. Medieval knights had a visor. The debate is a rich one. Did the psychological effect of the helmet enhance military performance by suppressing fear, or did it contribute to the reckless charges and catastrophic tactical errors that characterize some of the most famous medieval battles? The heavily armored knight on a warhorse, visor down, committed absolutely to the charge, is an enormously effective weapon. He is also, in the wrong terrain against the right opposition, a weapon that cannot stop itself. Both things are true. The psychology that makes the charge devastating also makes it sometimes unstoppable in the wrong direction. You know this. You've felt the thing the German knight described. The closing of the world. You've felt it tip from useful into dangerous on days when the ground was wrong and the orders were unclear and the visor had done its job perhaps a little too well. You learned to monitor it. To keep a thread of the careful self available even when the rest had been sealed away behind steel. This is the real skill. Not the sword work, not the riding. The ability to manage your own mind inside a helmet in the minutes before violence. It takes longer to learn than anything else. It is never entirely mastered. You stop being a man the moment the visor closes. You become something else. Something the enemy needs to believe is unstoppable. Most days, you believe it too. A knight's armor speaks before he does. You understand this earlier than most. The first time you ride into a tournament ground on a borrowed horse and mismatched armor that has been repaired so many times the original metal is mostly memory, you see it in the way eyes move across you. Assessment. Calculation. The silent reading of a man by his equipment before he has spoken a single word. The armor tells them, this man is not rich. This man's equipment has seen considerable use. This man either cannot afford better or has been unable to protect what he had. What it also tells them, if they know how to read it, this man has fought. This man's armor has been repaired because it has been hit. This man is still here, which means whoever hit him is not. Dents, it turns out, have a complicated social meaning. New armor means money and inexperience. Perfectly maintained armor means money and careful management. Battered and repaired armor means something else, means time in the field, means surviving things that left marks. Among men who know the difference, battered armor is not embarrassing. It is a record. A curriculum vitae written in metal. You begin to understand that what you wear is not simply protection. It is communication. Every decision made in the design and maintenance of your equipment is a statement about who you are, who you want to be seen as, and what you want the man across the field to think before the fighting begins. Your coat of arms, painted on your shield and, in more elaborate configurations, incorporated into the design of your armor, operates on a different register entirely. Where the condition of your armor speaks to your personal history, your heraldry speaks to your family, your allegiances, your place in the vast feudal web of obligation and loyalty that organizes the medieval world. A red lion rampant on a gold field says something different from a black cross on white. Not just visually but politically, genealogically, socially. A herald can read a coat of arms the way a scholar reads a text, extracting lineage, alliance, and history from color and symbol. In battle, this matters practically. You need to know instantly, in the chaos of the melee, whether the man beside you is friend or enemy. Heraldry solves this problem, imperfectly but usably. At court, the same information operates differently. Your arms precede you into rooms. They're recognized before your name is announced. They carry reputations you may or may not have earned and some you may actively be trying to overcome. The historical record on medieval armor as communication is extensive and mostly overlooked by popular history in favor of the armor's more dramatic functions. But the heralds, the specialists in the reading and recording of coats of arms, were among the most important figures in medieval political life precisely because they were fluent in this language. Tournament heralds who announced fighters by their arms were not performing a ceremonial function. They were broadcasting information. They were telling the crowd and the opposing fighters who this person was, who they fought for, what family they came from, what alliances they represented. A mistake could cause a diplomatic incident. A good herald was worth his weight in practical metal. The fringe detail is one that the romance of medieval history has almost entirely obscured. There was a thriving and largely unsentimental trade in second-hand armor throughout the medieval period. Armor taken from battlefield dead, stripped from prisoners, purchased from the families of men who would never need it again. This armor was repaired, repainted, and worn by the next man who needed it. Sometimes the previous owner's markings were carefully removed or painted over. Sometimes, whether through laziness or a stranger form of respect, traces remained. A knight might ride into battle wearing armor that still carried, beneath the new paint, the ghost of another man's heraldry. The debate concerns what this meant to the men involved. Some historians treat the second-hand armor trade as purely economic, a practical response to the enormous cost of quality equipment in a world where most knights were not wealthy enough to maintain a full harness in mint condition. Others point to accounts suggesting that wearing another man's armor carried meaning beyond the practical. That some men sought out the armor of famous fighters, believing something of the previous owner persisted in the metal. Not haunting, exactly. More like inheritance. You wear your armor now. Your own, earned and maintained and marked with the particular dents of your particular history. When you look at the breastplate, You can trace specific campaigns in its surface. A tournament in the east where you were unhorsed in the third pass. A skirmish near the northern border where an axe caught you wrong and the blacksmith spent 3 days restoring the shape. The armor tells your story whether you want it to or not. Every campaign leaves a mark. Every repair is a date, a place, a near miss. You are wearing your history. And at some point you stop being bothered by what it says. The first time you hear a musket fired in anger, you don't understand what you're hearing. It's not what you expect. You've been told about firearms. You've seen the hand cannons that have been appearing with increasing frequency on the edges of European warfare, strange and unreliable devices that seem more likely to injure their operators than their targets. You've filed them under curiosities. Under things that might matter eventually but don't matter yet. Then you hear the sound. Not the sound of a crossbow, which you know intimately, the sharp snap of tension releasing and the brief whistle of the bolt. Not the sound of siege machinery, which is slow and massive and announces itself in the grinding of ropes and the creak of timber. This is different. A crack, sudden and absolute, like a large branch breaking but compressed, condensed, wrong in a way that your body registers before your mind does. And then a man in full plate, 30 yards to your left, drops. Not stumbles. Not reels. Drops. Like something has simply removed the structure from inside him. You stand still for a moment, processing. The armor didn't stop it. This is the thought that finds you, cutting through the noise and the confusion and the instinctive tactical assessment your mind is running simultaneously. Not the man is dead, though he is. Not what do we do now, though that question matters urgently. This thought, arriving with terrible clarity. The armor didn't stop it. The world you have spent your entire life training for, the world organized around the premise that a man in quality armor was the most formidable individual fighting unit on any European battlefield, has just received notice that the premise is changing. Not today. Not completely. Not yet. These early firearms are slow and unreliable and require conditions that battle rarely provides. Your armor will remain relevant for decades yet. You know this. The rational part of your mind knows this. But the armor didn't stop it. The historical record on the transition from medieval armored warfare to gunpowder armies is long, complicated, and considerably less clean than the popular narrative suggests. Firearms did not end the age of knights overnight. The process took more than a century and was driven as much by economics and politics as by technology. What gunpowder changed, initially, was not whether armor worked but what it cost to make armor that worked. Armorers responded to the musket by making plate thicker, heavier, specifically proof-tested against ball shot. You take a finished breastplate, shoot it at close range, examine the dent. If the metal holds, if the ball doesn't penetrate, you stamp it or mark it as proof. The dent is left visible. It is the mark of quality. The mark of a piece that has been tested against the thing it needs to stop. This is where the word bulletproof comes from. Not from later centuries. From medieval and early modern armorers who developed the proof test as a selling point and left the evidence visible on the finished piece. But proof armor against musket shot requires metal thick enough and heavy enough to make the full harness barely wearable. 60 pounds. 70. 80. The trade-off becomes impossible. You cannot ask men to fight in armor that exhausts them before the engagement begins simply to stop a weapon that a trained musketeer can reload and fire 3 times a minute. The mathematics of the battlefield have changed. The knight as the decisive unit of an army doesn't survive the arithmetic. The fringe detail is this. There are accounts from the later medieval and early modern period of knights who continued to wear full armor into battles where it was increasingly ineffective, not from ignorance but from something else. Something that the accounts describe with various words, habit, pride, superstition, identity, but that reads, in retrospect, like a man unwilling to become someone he doesn't recognize. The armor was not just equipment. It was, for men who had worn it since adolescence, the physical expression of who they were. To remove it, to ride into battle in the lighter and more practical equipment of the new warfare, was to admit a transformation that went deeper than tactics. The debate is whether these men were tragic figures clinging to obsolescence, or rational actors making a defensible choice in a transitional period when the outcomes were still genuinely uncertain. Probably some of each. You clean your sword that evening. Not because it needs it. Because your hands need something to do while your mind works through what the afternoon has shown you. The armor sits on its stand. It looks the same as it did this morning. It is the same as it did this morning. Nothing about it has changed. The world around it has changed instead. You don't know yet exactly what that means for you. You know the direction of the answer. You know the answer won't arrive all at once. You know you'll keep riding out, keep wearing the armor, keep doing the work in the ways you know how to do it, while the world gradually reorganizes itself around a different kind of fighter. The armor doesn't stop bullets. But you keep wearing it anyway. Not because it will save you. Because you don't know how to go to war without it. You pass your sword to him one evening. Not in ceremony. Not with speeches or witnesses or the formal weight of ritual. Just one evening, after the hall has emptied and the fire has burned to embers and your squire, now grown into a man with his own campaigns behind him and his own squire trailing after him, is sitting across from you in the quiet the way he used to when he was young and tired and uncertain. You reach across and hand him the sword. He takes it with both hands, the way he was taught, the way you taught him. Eyes wide for a moment, the man briefly overlaid by the boy. He doesn't say thank you. He doesn't have to. You've been on more campaigns than you can now accurately count. The number stopped mattering somewhere in the middle years when it became clear that counting was less useful than simply continuing. You've worn armor in rain and heat and snow and the particular miserable damp of early spring that finds every gap in the best-fitted harness. You've slept in fields and ditches and the backs of carts and once, upright against a dead horse that was the only windbreak available. You've done the thing this entire story has been about. You've slept in your armor. Hundreds of times. Thousands of nights on campaign where the armor stayed on because the alternative was unacceptable, because the dark outside the camp held genuine threat, because your body had learned to rest inside steel the way other bodies learned to rest in beds. The armor is on its stand now. Has been for some time. Your squire still oils it. Still checks the buckles and tests the straps with the careful habit of training that outlasts its necessity. You haven't told him to stop. It costs nothing and it seems to matter to him in the way that maintaining the connection to what things were helps a person make sense of what things are becoming. The world has continued doing what worlds do. Changing. Reorganizing itself around new technologies and new politics and new ideas about how power should be organized and expressed. The armored knight on a warhorse is not gone entirely. He persists in ceremonies, in pageants, in the elaborate tournaments that have become more theater than preparation. But the battles are fought differently now. Have been for years. You don't resent it. Most days. The historical coda is quiet but worth hearing. The knights who survived the transition from the medieval to the early modern period, the ones who lived long enough to see the world they were trained for become the world the books would later describe as historical, these men left a more complex legacy than the popular narrative usually acknowledges. Some of them wrote memoirs, reflections, instructions for younger men that mixed tactical advice with something closer to philosophy. What these documents share, across different languages and different countries and different decades of the long transition, is a particular quality of attention. The attention of men who knew what they had been part of and were trying, with varying success, to put it into words before it became impossible to explain to people who hadn't lived it. They struggled with the task, which is part of what makes the documents affecting. The things they most wanted to convey were precisely the things most resistant to language. What it felt like to wear armor through a long night. What the visor did to the mind. What it meant to sleep half-present on cold ground with your hand on a sword that might be needed in the next minute, or might not be needed until dawn. The fringe detail is the one that stays with you longest. Several museums, in different countries, hold suits of armor recovered not from armories or display contexts but from private chambers. Found propped beside beds, or laid across trunks, or positioned in corners of rooms in ways that suggest their owners kept them close in old age not for any practical military reason but for something else. Whether that something else was habit or comfort or memory or simply the unwillingness to put distance between themselves and the object that had defined their lives for 50 years, no one can say with certainty. You understand it. The debate, if there is one worth having at this stage, is about what knighthood meant beyond its military function. Whether it was, at its deepest level, a code of conduct, a social role, an economic system, a psychological identity, or something that contained all of these without being reducible to any one of them. You've stopped trying to answer the question with language. The answer is in the sword you just handed across the fire. It's in the armor on its stand that your squire will oil tomorrow morning as if the campaigns might resume at any moment. It's in the way you still check, before you sleep, that your sword is within reach. Old habits. Honest habits. Somewhere in a chapel, a tapestry still hangs. A child will point to the figure in the corner one day. The one in battered mail with the visor up and the expression that is neither triumphant nor defeated. The expression of a man who has been doing this for a very long time and understands, finally, what it costs, and what it means. The child will ask who that is. And maybe someone will remember. Not the battles. Not the banners. Not the official record of campaigns won and borders held and ransoms negotiated and tournaments finished. The man. The man who lay on cold ground inside 50 pounds of metal and listened to the dark and learned, over years and decades, to rest inside the weight of his own life. That will be enough. The fire has burned low. Your sword is within reach. You close your eyes. And for once, completely and entirely you sleep. Thanks for listening tonight. If this helped you rest, hit subscribe. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope the dark outside your window sounds nothing like a medieval campaign. Sweet dreams.